You're listening to The Nourished Child, episode number 104.
Welcome to the Nourished Child podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Today we are talking about baby food. There's a lot of options when it comes to feeding your baby. And in this episode, I'm chatting about the history of baby food, what's important to know and think about it as you begin that first foods journey, and some guidance about your options, whether it's spoon feeding or baby-led weaning. You can find today's show notes and all the links that you'll hear me talk about over at jillcastle.com/104. That's 104 for episode number 104. Let's cue the music. Hey there, welcome back to The Nourished Child. I'm your host, Jill Castle. I'm a registered dietitian and I specialize in pediatric nutrition. And that's pretty much what we talk about on this show. We talk a lot about food and nutrition for children anywhere from ages birth through adolescence. And today we're focusing on babies. It's been a while since I've focused on babies, and I wanted to bring a show that talked about some of the stuff that I've actually been writing about lately and find myself focused on lately. And that has a lot to do with nutrition in that first year of life. Today, I just arrived home from a trip to Florida with my son. It's February break here. And every February for at least the last 4 or 5 years, he's been going down to Florida to train for rowing. It's their on-the-water training in the winter. And I've been going with him, and it's been a really wonderful tradition for the two of us to be able to go down there. He obviously rows every day for about 7 or 8 hours, obviously with little breaks and rests in between, but they're on the water pretty much every day for a solid 7 days. And I think I've mentioned on the show before that I have been taking a Learn to Row class. And in the winter, it's primarily focused on erging, or working and learning how to properly use a rowing machine, and then also jumping into a tank. Not me, my body jumping into a tank, but a tank that's set up with oars and seats and sliders so that you can actually get a good feel of what it's like to actually put your oars in water and pull them. So I've been doing that. I've been doing that for the last 2 months, but down in Florida, I had the opportunity to hop in a boat with my son and another young man and his mother, and we got to put our training, I guess, to the test. And I'll tell you, it was not easy. It's not easy to row a boat. Those oars are long. You have to coordinate and be in sync with everybody in the boat. Otherwise, the boat gets quite tippy. And my son did inform me that I tipped the boat a few times, which makes it even more scary and more challenging. But it was also fun. And those little moments when all the oars go in the water at the same time and everybody's pulling at the same time, it's quite a great feeling. But anyways, while I was down there, we were in Orlando, so home of Disney. I saw lots of little kids there and had the opportunity to see a lot of what they were eating and when they were eating and how they were eating. And things haven't changed that much since when my kids were little. There's still lots of kids in their strollers eating all kinds of food. There are lots of little ones walking around with big cups of soda with straws. And it just made me realize that I probably should do a show based on early feeding. And although I've done a few about nutrition in the first year of life, I wanted to revisit this topic. So today we're talking about baby food, early feeding, and really eating in the first year of life. So I'm going to not get into the deep details because I trust that you will be able to find a lot of what we talk about today in my book, The Smart Mom's Guide to Starting Solids, and my other book, Fearless Feeding, How to Raise Healthy Eaters from High Chair to High School. But I do want to kind of gloss over some of this stuff because I've been doing a lot of writing about brain development and health and how nutrients and nutrition relate to that. So I'm going to tie some of that in, but I want to start with the history of baby food. And I had to look this up, and I actually referred to a book called Inventing Baby Food by an author by the name of Amy Bentley, and I'll include the link to that book in the show notes. Amy Bentley is a historian and an associate professor in the Department of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health at NYU, New York University. And just to summarize, it's an interesting book, but to summarize kind of where we used to be and where we are now, it's pretty interesting. So I'm just going to take you through a little timeline, very, very brief. You can dig into the book if you really want the detailed notes on this. But in the 1600s, parents were encouraged to breastfeed their babies until they were 2 years old. In the 1700s, so 100 years later, things evolved and parents were encouraged to breastfeed their babies until they were just over a year of age. Then we hit the 1800s and babies were still encouraged to be on a milk-only diet because meat and other solid foods were considered bad for babies. And they didn't start solids until a baby's teeth came in. We know now that we don't have to wait for the teeth to come in. Actually, babies are pretty good at chewing and grinding food with their toothless jaws, if you will. But in the 1800s, fruits and vegetables were avoided until age 4 for fear of disease. So it's really interesting. Now we don't say avoid fruits and vegetables. We highly encourage early introduction of fruits and vegetables, not only for the nutrients, but for the flavor and flavor preference development. In the 1900s, we still encouraged breast milk feedings for baby, and solids began when the first tooth appeared. So we didn't wait for a lot of teeth to appear. We were just looking for that first tooth. And for most baby, that's somewhere between 4 and 6 months of age. Mead Johnson, which is currently a formula company, and they make some different baby and toddler related food products. But in the 1900s, around actually 1915, Mead Johnson introduced the first baby food for sale. So the first commercial baby food for sale in grocery stores. In 1926, Gerber developed strained baby food. So they were the first company to really put strained baby food out in the market. And in 1931, the Gerber baby was born. And we still have the Gerber baby today. They run a contest to define every year who the Gerber baby is going to be for the coming year. Gerber was the leading baby food company in 1931, and by the end of the 1930s, baby food had become its own category of food. So, now, I want to jump forward to the 1990s when I had my own children, because even from 1996, when I had my first child, to today, we've seen a lot of changes. And a lot of the changes have happened because of research that's rolled out. And it's also happened, well, mostly because the research rolled out and we understand things a lot better. For me, spoon feeding your baby was the way to go back in the 90s. I'm sure there were moms out there and dads out there using a solid self-feeding approach without the spoon. But for the most part, you started your baby at 4 months on a rice cereal fortified with iron via or using the spoon. The guidelines were to, after introducing cereal, to then introduce fruit because that would be well accepted by your baby. It was sweet. And then vegetables and then meats. So strained beef or strained chicken. And then after you had introduced each of these single ingredient baby foods, you could start to mix them up as long as your baby wasn't showing any signs of allergies. So, in terms of the timing of everything, at about 6 to 8 months, you were supposed to really step up the texture So you're moving from something really smooth, like a smooth fruit puree, to something that was a little bit more chunkier. So that was from 6 to 8 months. And at the same time, during that 6 to 8 month window, you could also introduce like a finger food, like a cracker that could melt in your baby's mouth, or little Cheerios when your baby had developed the pincer grasp, where they take their forefinger and their thumb and they can put it together and actually pick something up. That usually happens around 6 to 8 months of age. And so you could offer little foods like green peas or little Cheerios, something with a hole in it in case it was swallowed. Your baby could still, not choke, could still get air through his windpipe. And I remember my first food for my child was like the Cheerios Oat-O type cereal, because they melt pretty quickly in the mouth and there was a hole in the middle, so the choking risk was lower. After 8 months, really, you were moving to chopped food. So food that you had in your own diet that you chopped up and presented to your child who had, the pincer grasp and could start to feed themselves. And then by 10 to 12 months of age, you were really working on helping your baby feed himself. So teaching your baby to use a spoon, encouraging your baby to pick up his own food and feed himself. So those were the guidelines that I used when I introduced solids to my babies. And as the years have rolled by, things have changed. If you look at the last decade, really, 10 to 14 years, we have a method of introducing solids called baby-led weaning. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But one of the things I want to make a point about is that the guidelines for starting solids back in the 90s and even prior to that were largely made without any real research or methodology or practical guidelines. They were really made on common sense and what people believed to be the best for baby. What to start with, vegetables versus fruit versus cereals, that often, I believe, was sort of a random delegation in the early years. And then more recently, back in the early 2000s, in the late 1990s, we had researchers start looking at what is the benefit of starting baby on a grain-based cereal that was fortified with iron. What were the benefits of doing vegetables first or fruit first? It wasn't until recently that we really started looking at research to guide us in terms of our recommendations for introducing solids to babies in that first year of life. But one of the things that strikes me as I look back into this is that, the transitions from pureed food to chunky foods to finger foods to self-feeding, those transitions were pretty timely and pretty aggressive. You weren't in a stage of feeding with the spoon or even with baby-led weaning today. You're not in one particular stage for very long. So there's definitely a marching forward in that first year of life of getting through transitions so that you're getting your baby to that point where they're eating family food. They're eating the food that you're eating. This episode of the Nourished Child podcast is brought to you by the Smart Mom's Guide to Starting Solids, a guide showcasing the many considerations moms have when embarking on the process of beginning first foods with their baby. From the timing of starting and the important nutrients for your baby's body and brain growth, to your feeding style and the method used for feeding, the Smart Mom's Guide to Starting Solids has your questions covered. You'll get the latest on food allergies, supplementation, and more. Head over to www.jillcastle.com/books to grab your copy today. So why is it even important to start solids? I think this is some information you really need to have and understand, because when you understand this, you'll be a little bit more invested in going about it in a manner whereby you reach the goals that we want you to reach by the end of that first year of life. So I see 3 main reasons for why it's important to start solids. Number 1 is nutrition and nutrients and filling those dietary gaps that might exist if you're breastfeeding your baby, but also nutrition for the development of the brain. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. The second reason is to help your baby learn to eat, to develop those eating skills so that he can feed himself and regulate his own eating. The third reason why it's important to start solids is that food preference development happens very early in life. So what our babies like to eat, what our children like to eat, are developed in those first 3 to 5 years of life. So having a lot of variety on board, textures, flavors, spices. If we want our kids to eat a wide variety of foods, they need to start to see a wide variety of foods in those early years. Let's go back just actually to the nutrition component. Babies who are breastfed, which is the gold standard, which is what we all recommend, or we should be recommending that babies be breastfed. And if they're not able to be breastfed, we have infant formula that is formulated to mimic breast milk to provide all those nutrients that are so important for your baby. For me, my philosophy is fed is best. To me, if you can breastfeed, great. If you can't, great. We have infant formula. Your baby's needs nutritionally will be well met by either milk source. So fed is best. All babies need to be fed, and they need to have nutritious sources of food so that they can grow and develop. And it's not just their body that's growing and developing, it's their brain as well. So there are gaps that we know will exist at around 6 months of age for babies who are breastfed. And those are an iron gap and a zinc gap. And mainly that gap exists because your baby's requirement for those nutrients goes up quite a bit at around 6 months. And if you're breastfeeding, the content of those nutrients, such as iron and zinc, go down at around 6 months. So they decrease a little bit while your baby's requirement goes up quite a bit. So it creates a gap. And starting foods, which we call complementary foods, fill those gaps that can exist. So that's why we say if you're spoon feeding, we'd like to see you start your baby with an iron-fortified grain-based cereal. So like a rice cereal or an oat cereal or barley fortified with iron. And if you can find one that's fortified with zinc as well, that's even better. So that recommendation is there to close that nutritional gap that gets created at around 6 months. Meat is another first food that closes that gap. Meat is rich in iron and in zinc, and it closes the gap that exists between decreasing levels of iron and zinc in breast milk and increasing requirements by your baby. We know that another gap that can exist in breastfed babies is a vitamin D gap. And for many of you who may have had babies in the last 10 to 20 years, you probably were told as you were leaving the hospital to continue the vitamin D supplement that was started in the hospital. So the recommendations are that babies who are born start a vitamin D supplement within just a couple of days of life. So usually by the time you're leaving the hospital after delivery, your baby should be on a vitamin D supplement, especially if you are breastfeeding. But honestly, all babies, I believe, should be on a supplement because even if you're formula feeding your baby is not getting enough formula to provide enough vitamin D during that critical first year of life. So the recommendations for vitamin D are for all babies who are exclusively breastfed or partially breastfed to have a vitamin D supplement, and all babies and even young toddlers who are consuming infant formula or whole milk. That would be for children over the age of 1. If those children are not consuming a liter of infant formula or a liter, 32 ounces of whole milk a day, they need a vitamin D supplement because they're just not getting the the amount of milk or the amount of formula that's going to give them the adequate level of vitamin D. Fiber is another gap. Obviously, when babies are drinking breast milk or they are drinking infant formula, they are getting no fiber. So starting solids allows fiber to be introduced into their diet. And it's also why a lot of times babies get constipated when they start solids, because we're introducing a more complex diet that has some fiber in it. So the fiber would be in oats or barley cereal, or if you're introducing fruits or vegetables, there's going to be some fiber in those foods. And your baby's gastrointestinal tract is not used to having fiber in it. So there's this adaptation period where your baby's body is learning how to digest and process fiber. So that's a gap. It's a gap when it's a liquid diet, and we want to fill that gap. We know fiber is beneficial to all children, and we start to give it when our babies are young. Again, we don't do it before 6 months. We want at least exclusive breastfeeding or infant formula exclusively for the first 6 months of life. We also know that there's a potential omega-3 fatty acid gap. If you're a mom who's breastfeeding and you're not supplementing with omega-3 fatty acids, your baby is probably not getting enough. So starting solid foods can complement those gaps, can fill in those gaps, providing those nutrients that either your body isn't providing through breast milk or your baby isn't getting enough of because they just simply aren't able to drink enough formula yet to cover what those requirements would be. So the second reason I mentioned in terms of why it's important to start solids is eating skills or learning how to eat. Babies are not born knowing how to eat. They are born knowing how to suck and swallow. And so introducing food to them allows them to learn how to chew, how to manipulate food in the mouth from left to right, from top to bottom, and how to swallow. So they really do learn to eat, and they move from that very thin, watery, almost like a liquid cereal. When you're mixing it, you're making it really soupy, to a gradual thickening of that, and then pureed foods, then chunkier foods, then solid, chopped up foods. They are learning progressively over time with those texture changes how to eat food. We know that there is some evidence that suggests if we don't start our children on solids at around 6 months of age, and if we delay solids to 9 months or later, there's a higher risk that your child can be a pickier eater, and also a higher risk of delays in language development. Because remember, babies learn to talk after they learn to eat. And so learning to eat helps them develop the muscles so that they can learn to talk. Learning to eat also involves the fine motor skills. So picking up food with, that raking across the tray with your hand and just sort of grabbing as much food as possible and delivering it to the mouth. That's called, raking food. Babies move from doing that to using their pincer grasp, where they're taking their forefinger and their thumb and they're picking up little bits and putting it in their mouth, to using a spoon themselves, using a fork, starting to, in the toddler years, learning how to cut food with maybe a plastic knife. So those are all fine motor skills. And even just the chewing and the swallowing, those are fine motor skills too. And so learning to eat helps refine those fine motor skills. So that's important. That's important. That's an important role that solids play in young infants' diets. Food preferences. I mentioned earlier, there's a short window to cultivate your child's majority of food preferences, and that's generally felt to be by the age of 3. And a lot of food preferences will be formed by age of 3. And by age 5, most of your child's food preferences will be established. Now, people learn to like new foods all the time later in life, but that first 5-year of life window is sort of the most critical window for cultivating a broad palate. So what happens when you cultivate a broad palate? You are sort of shoring up that protection around preventing your child from being a picky eater. And obviously, when you're promoting a variety of foods and exposing your child to a variety of foods, it's more likely that they'll end up liking a variety of foods. And that means they are more likely to having a healthy diet. So the word is variety. And it's not just lots of different fruits and vegetables. It is lots of different grains, lots of different protein sources, lots of different fruits, vegetables, fats, dairy products, varied textures, lots of different textures, shredded, chunky, smooth, wet, crunchy, flaky, all kinds of different textures for children to experience. And it also means variety of flavors. And, anything from salty to savory to umami to spicy, all of those things are a go in that first 5 years of life. So it's really a time where starting solids can play a really important role in terms of exposing your baby to lots of different flavors and textures and foods. Now, in terms of how you start solids, there, in my mind, are generally 3 ways you can go about this. Number 1, using the spoon, which I talked about earlier, and keeping in mind that you are moving at a pretty progressive pace from 6 months to 12 months. So if you think about it, at 6 months, you're starting with puree food on a spoon. By 12 months, your child's eating the family food chopped up in a manner that reflects his eating skills. We know that there's some research around, baby cereal that's fortified with iron. We know that one researcher has found that it is the only researched method to prevent iron deficiency anemia, and that's because it provides a consistent source of iron. We also know there's a researcher who has said that meat, beef, chicken, dark meat, turkey are the only guaranteed ways of providing both iron and zinc around that 6-month period to fill in the gap, especially if you're nursing. We know that another method for introducing solid food to baby is baby-led weaning. Now, baby-led weaning began around 2005 by a woman named Jill Rapley. It's a self-feeding method beginning at 6 months of age with foods that a baby can hold himself. So it might be a strip of food that he can hold in his hand or a meltable fist-size bite of food. And there's a lot of different websites out there that will give you suggestions on proper foods for baby-led weaning. Essentially, your baby is deciding what to eat, how much, and when to eat. And there's been several research studies on baby-led weaning, research studies that focus on choking. Are they more apt to choke with baby-led weaning than spoon feeding? There's research on, is the diet adequate? Is there enough nutrients provided with this method? There's research on self-regulation, pickiness, body weight. Generally, there is a belief, and I believe this as well, there's been some research using education prior to starting baby-led weaning with parents, educating parents about iron-rich foods, avoiding choking items, getting enough calories by using high-fat foods. Those research studies have shown that it is beneficial to educate parents before they embark on baby-led weaning so they understand all the different nutrients that are required and how to prevent choking. And those studies have been very positive and have been very promising in terms of showing that when parents are well educated about baby-led weaning, they do very well with it. The benefits of baby-led weaning are generally recognized as babies are better at self-regulating their appetite. They are leaner, less picky, by parent report. But review studies, there just was a new review study that came out in 2018 that suggests questions remain and further study is needed. So one of the things I would recommend to you if you are doing baby-led weaning, just learn more about the nutrition component and how to prevent choking, and you'll do great if you just take the time to do that. On this show, I interviewed Leslie Schilling, who is the co-author of Born to Eat, which is a book about baby-led weaning. That's episode number 46. And I also interviewed Natalia Stasenko about using a flexible approach to starting solids. That's episode number 48. Now, a flexible way of starting solids is your third opportunity or your third option for feeding your baby in the first year of life. And that's really just a combined sort of free range way of feeding your baby. It's using the spoon and using baby-led weaning. It's using both approaches to reap the benefits of both angles. So ensuring calories and nutrients are delivered by spoon, but also using baby-led weaning so that your baby is able to pace themselves, eat till he's full, stop when he's done, all those good things that come from self-regulation. So I want to, before we wrap this up, I want to talk a little bit about brain development because it's pretty intensively dependent on that first 1,000 days or the first 2 years of your baby's life and your pregnancy with your baby. That 1,000-day time frame is very important in terms of brain development. So prenatally, when you're pregnant and in the first 2 years of life, the brain is rapidly growing and it's laying sort of the scaffolding and the blueprint for information transmission and memory and learning and personality and emotional regulation. There's just so much happening. I mean, we can see if you just watch your baby or watch other young toddlers, they practically morph before your eyes in the everyday simple things like purposeful movement and their language development. That's all happening because their brains are developing. And even as kids get older, their social skills blossom in the preschool years. They engage in formal learning at elementary school. So the brain is constantly being utilized, refined, developed. And so nutrition and nutrients are key ingredients to this, especially in that first year of life and the first 2 years of life. So it's important that, starting solids is just such a key area of helping get your baby started on the right foot in terms of brain health and development, in terms of body growth, in terms of flavor preferences, learning how to eat, eating skills, fine motor skills, language development, so many good things coming from starting solids on time, with purpose, and with a strategy. Now, you can learn more about nutrients for brain development in episode number 78. I had Dr. Robert Murray on to talk about brain development in the young infant and young toddler. And I also have an episode, one of my very early episodes, so I don't guarantee how good it sounds, episode number 5, which is titled Baby Nutrients Parents Need to Watch. And in that episode, I talk a lot about iron and zinc and omega-3 fats, choline. There's a long list of nutrients that are important for babies in that first year of life. So when we think about starting solids in that first year of life around 6 months of age, obviously we're going to pay attention to our baby's developmental readiness and making sure our children are ready to start solids, because it's not good for your baby if you're pushing solids too fast on them. They're not ready and you're pushing to get going. It can be a negative experience for them. It's also not good to delay too long, because if your baby is ready to get eating food and is interested and has all the developmental readiness signs, and you're holding him back, your baby's going to be frustrated. And that can set up a whole different set of issues. So here are some of my recommendations for starting solids and some things I want you to think about. Number one, have a plan. Just don't go into this without a plan. Learn about it. Think about what method you want to use. Do you want to use a spoon? Do you want to use baby-led weaning? Do you want to use a combination of both? Think about your time frames. If you're starting around 6 months of age, when does the next change need to happen? What is the next food or texture challenge you're going to present your baby with? How are you going to introduce new foods to your child? So think these things through. One of the things that I see with parents is that they get caught in a little bit of a pickle because they haven't forecasted what they're going to need to be doing. And when they don't know what they need to be doing, they kind of just keep doing the same thing that they've always been doing. And what does that look like? It looks like the baby who's still on purees at age 8, 9, 10 months of age. And really, babies shouldn't still be on pureed food at that age. They should be moving forward. So have a plan. Make some decisions about how you're going to orchestrate your strategy from age 6 months to 12 months. Number 2, tune in to your baby's readiness signals. Are they interested in the food that you're eating? Are they able to sit up in a chair? Are they able to hold their head up by themselves? And there's some certain developmental readiness signs that need to be there that tell you that your baby can handle starting solids without choking, without gagging too much, and without having a negative experience. And then not only do you need to understand your baby's readiness signals, you also need to understand responsive feeding. Paying attention to the signals, paying attention to the appetite cues. So if your baby's hungry, knowing that that's what your baby is telling you, your baby's telling you he's hungry, and understanding and recognizing that, but also recognizing when your baby is done eating and honoring that, stopping the feeding session when you're seeing those kinds of cues. I'll include a link to an article that I wrote called What is Responsive Feeding? So you'll have a sense of all of that. And baby's developmental signs of readiness. I have a chart in the Smart Mom's Guide to Starting Solid, which gives you all the information you need to know about whether your baby's ready or not to start solids. So number 3 is be open to changing your feeding approach if it's not working for your child. So you may have high hopes for doing baby-led weaning, but your baby might not enjoy it. It might be that your baby is struggling at meals, gagging a lot, being upset, crying. Those are signs it's not working for your child. So my best recommendation is just be open to seeing what works and what doesn't work. Don't get too married to one way of doing things, because if you do, if you're married to spoon feeding, for example, and your baby wants to be independent, for example, one of my children didn't really want to be spoon fed. She wanted to have a hold of that spoon. She didn't want me to have any involvement whatsoever. A child like that's going to do really well with baby-led weaning because they get total independence. And it might be a struggle at first because they can't really feed themselves, but babies learn fast and they get the hang of it. So while you may have hopes and desires for exactly how you want this first feeding, this 6-month starting solid phase to go, be open to the fact that it might not go exactly the way you want it to, and that's okay. It's no fault of your own. It just is what is. Be flexible. Be willing to change your approach for the betterment of your child. Number 4, get a wide variety in the diet, a wide variety of flavors. Don't be afraid of spice or heat or sour foods. And again, these may not be the foods that you start at 6 months, but by the time you're moving your child into the 8, 9, 10-month phase, it's quite fine to start to introduce different flavors. Remember, babies in India are eating curries and spices, and they do fine. Babies in Latin America are eating salsa and chili peppers in their food. So just because, our cuisine may not be heavily spicy, it does not mean that you cannot introduce mild, moderate forms of these foods to your child over time. Get a wide variety of colors, textures, nutrients. Know your nutrients. Know which foods are rich in iron and zinc. Know which foods are vitamin C sources, vitamin A sources. Know what foods are going to be rich in omega-3 fatty acids so that you can start to expose your child to a wide variety of flavors, colors, textures, and nutrients. And I'll just remind you, sweets in the first 2 years of life aren't great for your baby because, again, those flavor preferences are developing and babies are already born with 9 months in utero, swimming in sweet amniotic fluid. And then if you're nursing, we know that breast milk is sweet. So if you offer your baby sweets in the first 2 years of life, you're reinforcing that flavor preference for sweet. So think about that. And think again, what's your strategy going to be about sweets? They're not something that you need to demonize, but I think in the consideration of everything that's going on in terms of growth and development and brain and flavor preferences, it's important to think through how you want to handle sweets. Number 5, move along. Expect the transitions. If you're starting with the spoon, you're not going to be on the spoon forever. You're going to be transitioning away from the spoon at around 9 or 10 months, and your baby is going to be feeding himself. Expect these transitions. They happen fast. Again, remember, at 6 months you're starting. By a year, we want your baby at the family table eating the family food. And last, number 6, get your baby to the family table as soon as you can. Pull up the high chair. Even if your baby isn't even eating yet, there's lots of learning from sitting at the table with other family members and observing other eaters. So make it a social focus if your baby's younger than 6 months of age. Start to find opportunities to include your baby at the meal table as early as you can. It might be that you just have your baby there while you're nursing them or feeding a bottle to them, but they're part of the social dynamic and the camaraderie around the meal table, and that's a good thing. Okay, so just to summarize things and to wrap things up, starting solids around 6 months of age, super duper duper important thing. I want you to understand why. I hope I explained that well to you. And I also want you to understand your options. And nothing is set in stone. You can do it the way you need to do it and the way you feel most comfortable with for your baby. You have options. My book, The Smart Mom's Guide to Starting Solids, dives into all of this in a concise, to the point, 100-page, easy read. You can check it out on Amazon. I'll include the link in the show notes. I think it's one of the best $10 you'll ever spend when it comes to nourishing your baby in the first year of life. That's it for today. Next up on The Nourished Child is Rachelle Berry. She's a pediatric dietitian who works at the Marcus Center for Autism in Atlanta, and she's coming on the show to talk about helping children with autism eat better and the strategies she's using in her practice. I hope you'll tune in. But for now, thanks for joining me, and be sure to give that baby in your life a loving squeeze today. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.